Well, welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Ben Barry. I'm the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare here at the Institute. A former British Army officer, but 2.5 years past. Welcome. Particular welcome to so many professionals, legal professionals, Army professionals, professionals from the Ministry of Defence, and a few people like the members of the Army Legal Services who have a foot in both professional camps. For those of you who are here from the Army and the Ministry of Defence, a particular welcome, as both the British Army and the Ministry of Defence are corporate members of the Institute, and we very keen to see you here, and very keen also that you get the maximum out of the membership of this organisation. The Institute's got a lot to offer, and we're keen that you exploit it. The purpose for the meeting is has been pretty clear on the material that's set out, and I won't repeat that. If I can make the few dreary housekeeping announcements. You've discovered, I think, where tea and coffee is being served. There are some gentlemen's and ladies' facilities behind. There are some other ones on the floor below. We'll be going down to the 4th floor for lunch. If there's an emergency, you'll hear a deafening alarm. There are stairs that are next to the lift, and also an emergency exit over there. And the assembly area is Embankment Gardens, which is the very pretty and cool park as you immediately come out of the Institute front door. We've got a lot of speakers with a lot of interesting things to say. In the papers that you'll find on your seat, there are the full biographies of the speakers. So I'm going to offer as a convention for the day that the chairpeople for each session do not repeat the biographies, but merely introduce the speakers by appointment. I've also got a particular plea. It's great that we've got so many people from both professions here, but I would enjoin the lawyers to speak as far as possible without using legal jargon, and I'd even more plead with the serving and retired members of the military to refrain from your usual jaw-cracking and acronyms, or going too much into impenetrable military jargon. We've got a number of panels. They're all on the programme. At the end of each panel, there will be the opportunity for Q&A. If you're sitting on the table, you've got the microphones to pass round, and there will be, for each Q&A, members of ISS staff with some hand microphones for the people who are sitting in the back seats. Well, that's my part of the introduction. I'll now pass over to Brigadier Operational Law.
Actually, me first. I'm Simon Deacon. I'm the Director of Force Development from Army Headquarters. I work for Bruce Briley here on my left-hand side, who is Director General Capability. Thank you for coming today. I share this platform as a sponsor with Stuart Lithgow. He's here on my right-hand side, who will say a few words in a moment. I'd like to thank Ben Barry and IISS for hosting this today, both for the use of the facility and the cachet that being associated with this organisation brings. I suspect on the infrastructure side we're going to be thoroughly grateful for the air conditioning by the close of play today. I'd just really like to make 2 points to put some context on what we're going to be doing today. The first one is that we sit here not as the Ministry of Defence but as the Army and the lead service for land operations. Since we had financial delegation run through the Ministry of Defence, the Army becomes responsible, as do the other 2 services and indeed Joint Forces Command, for both garnering the evidence and structuring their own arguments for the development of their forces, for which they then have to negotiate and persuade the Ministry of Defence as we go forward. So it is incumbent upon us, as the Army and, if you like, the custodian of the land environment, to clear our own lines and justify and understand our own intellectual position going forward, rather than rely on somebody else to do it. And the second point I'd make is really tied up in the title of the day, and that is to ensure that we concentrate on future operations. This is all about force development. This is where we might be in the future. rather than concentrating on some of the more apparent studies and rulings that are going on at the moment, against which we will doubtless surf today at some stage. But it is extremely important that we understand and set the context for how we will be operating in future environments. Stuart.
Thank you. Well, first of all, obviously, Ben and your team, thank you very much. Marvellous facility. I'd also like to extend a welcome to the academics that are here. We have what really comprises the vast majority of the experts in the relevant fields that we're dealing with. There's a couple of notable exceptions, but actually the vast majority of them are here. And they're here voluntarily and on a self-funded basis. So we are particularly grateful for their attendance and the contribution that they're going to make to the work that we have planned. And each of them is fully aware that the aim of today is to take forward product that will inform further planning by the Army. So that's wonderful. So far as today is concerned, clearly it's going to be of benefit to the Army. It's also part of the process for the ALS continuing and improving its engagement with academia, which most of us in the ALS see as absolutely critical in terms of us improving the service that we provide to the Army in this area. And it is one stage in that process. And that leads us on to the paper that was produced by ALS Op Law. And of course, there's a degree of trepidation in producing something like that when you know that it's going to be read and considered by such a glittering array of academics. But it was put there, as the paper says, to prime thought of everybody who's attending today and to help provide some initial direction to the academics of the sorts of areas of interest that we have. Some of the issues, I'm conscious, are likely to be shot down, hopefully shot down in a rather sort of discreet but not too embarrassing fashion, because I'm conscious that some of them are developments that may take place, but if they do, are likely to be beyond the 10-year period. But unless we start to think about those, and then what we will do by the end of the day is focus our thoughts and conclusions on the more likely attitudes. And that's why we have Major Anna Roberts across the table from me, who's a scribe who's going to be recording those key points to take forward on Wednesday. So one further point that I've been reminded, and that is for the lawyers here, there are CPD, Continuous Professional Development forms, at the back of the room or just outside in the foyer. It's important that you fill those out, because that will also save money for the Ministry of Defence as counting towards your training. So, Jim, that's done, and perhaps I can now pass on to, I think it's going to be Adam Ward, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. We have a lot of substance to get through today, and I think looking at the agenda, it does tend to speak for itself and requires no further preambulatory interventions from me, except for making the obvious point that the first session is intended to look at the conflict and operational questions. We then move on to discussion of the strategic trends in law, and then the afternoon is really dedicated to trying to assemble some sort of synthesized picture, glimpsing out, as we've heard, as far as we can into the future in that 2025 time frame. Now, we have three speakers in the opening session. They've each got about 15 minutes to make all of the points that they want to make. I would encourage them to keep to schedule. If they do, we'll have 15 minutes at the end of this session for some questions and comments before we then move into the coffee break, during which we can have a more informal chat. The speakers will address us in the order in which they appear on the agenda, and we're going to hear first from Colonel Tim Law, Assistant Director of Force Development, Army HQ, who's going to familiarise us with some of the thinking emerging in the British Army about future land operations concepts and related matters. Then we'll move to Jim Maltby of DSTL, talking about technological developments as they impact on the conflict and operations environment. And then Ben Barry here from the Institute will talk about the adversarial element in the development of future conflict. So, Colonel Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much. As Adam said, I'm the Assistant Director of Force Development, in charge perhaps for predicting the future within the Army headquarters. There is, to that extent, a substantial piece of work in progress at the moment, elements of which I will cover in this brief. But what I really want to do is to talk a little bit about the environment and the threats that we are likely to operate within. So in essence, I'll be covering the three overlapping terrains of the future operating environment: the physical, the human, and the information terrain, the nature and the modus operandi of our potential adversaries and rivals, which will clearly be covered further by Brigadier Ben towards the end of this area, and then how we potentially will need to operate. And I'll touch lightly on this. As I said, some of this is work in progress, but I will raise some issues that in part precipitated this event being conceived in the first place last December. So terrain really needs to be seen as comprising three overlapping elements. Historically, we've seen terrain very much as physical, but in reality, what we have is many different terrains. The information terrain is global, the human terrain is both regional, if not global in scale, but the physical terrain, as I said, is extremely local. Whilst we may be required to operate in areas of climatic extremes, the priority must be for us, in accordance with MOD policy currently conceived, to the tropical and northern subtropical zones of Africa and Asia. That really is partly because it's where the majority of the world's population live, and the majority of political and economic activity is concentrated. But equally, our most likely expeditionary deployments will be in those areas that are populated urban zones, urban terrain, with a realistic probability of it being in the littoral, which involves riverine operations as well as coastal type operations. We've done quite a lot of work on the urban environment over the last few years in our Urban Warrior series. We found within that there are 8 urban terrain zones, each with different characteristics. In some of these zones, we're likely to find tunnels or other subterranean infrastructure. Given the likely locations to which we might deploy, we cannot rule out the requirement to operate in dense vegetation. This includes densely cultivated jungle, woods, and even western forests, and also deserts. In analysing the characteristics of these types of terrain, we've determined that there are common characteristics between the urban, riverine, and dense vegetation that can be termed complex physical terrain. We're quite used to talking about complex terrain in a land and operational environment, but often what we mean by that really is complex terrain from a physical sense. What we have defined within DFD is as a definition really of what that is. And in essence, it is a significant challenge to operate in these particular areas. So instead of talking about complex terrain as a means of covering human and information, we're talking here about physical terrain. You know, it's difficult when you cannot see to the full extent of the range of your weapons. It makes it difficult to ensure you're minimizing collateral damage. Excuse me. I came back from France with flu yesterday, which is quite unfortunate in this temperature. Moving on slightly to human terrain then. Population rises and accelerated urbanization will both increase and concentrate the demand for resources, in particular food, water, and energy. And the human terrain will almost certainly be highly complex. That is a quote that we've taken from the Future Character of Conflict paper that was done by the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre. It's almost certain that English will not be the mother tongue in the places to which we deploy. The ties between the multiple actors, agencies, audiences, and adversaries will fluctuate, and therefore they will defy set categorization. Furthermore, the interaction between people is increasingly fluid and less geographically bound due to communications technology. And this is exacerbated by diasporas, which have blurred the distinction between home and abroad. It's almost certain that the resources available to us will be less than the society requires or desires, and therefore crime, including shadow economic activity, is likely to flourish. Given the threats to their human security, many civilians will be armed, and we've seen this clearly on recent operational deployments that we've participated within. Our society at home will be ethnically diverse, geographically dispersed. 20% of UK citizens will live abroad in the time frame we're looking at. And globally connected, there will be a globally connected population that will be vulnerable to our adversaries' narrative. Our adversaries will almost certainly be from or similar to the local population, and as we've seen recently, be able to fade into it. And cultural perceptions, including those of time, will undoubtedly be different, not only between us and the local population, but between us and the other actors, agencies and partners with whom we operate. Perceptions of what is legal or appropriate are also likely to be different. So the local perception of our legitimacy may differ from our standing in international law. And again, we've defined within DFD here terrain, complex human terrain, to distinguish it potentially from complex physical and other terrain as a concept there. And you can see on the slide the definition that we've established for that. The most striking aspects of the information terrain will be the tempo, which is measured in minutes, and the scale, which is global. Intrusive and global media, generated by a plethora of individuals and organizations, have a rapid response time and a global distribution. When coupled with reductionist reporting, for example, things like Twitter, rolling news banners and news text alerts, this leads to a loss of context and easy manipulation by unconstrained actors. This battle of the narratives will take place in a fast-moving, decentralized, networked, and free market of ideas, opinions, and even raw data. Again, quotes that are taken from much higher level operational concepts and agreed with all of our main allies. Our access to and freedom of action across the electromagnetic spectrum and cyber environment is vital, but not assured. And finally, in cyberspace, the ability to remain concealed while attacking at range with plausible deniability will provide the opportunity for even small hostile groups to achieve strategic effect against the most powerful of adversaries. Such attacks, malicious or mischievous, could originate from anywhere in the world, and we've seen examples of this even taking place in the last few months, particularly emanating from China. So complex information terrain exists as well, and as I said earlier, we can't just categorize terrain as complex and really look at it as being physically complex. It's going to be challenging to overmatch the numerous changing narratives of our adversaries and rivals. And we should aim to enter the debate fast, managing the flaws in our understanding, something we're not particularly well placed to do currently. And the next slide just summarizes really the key points made on each of those terrains. Well, so much then for the environment. Moving on to the threat. Well, the nature of a conflict is likely to exhibit concurrent intercommunal violence, terrorism, insurgency, and pervasive criminality, and widespread disorder, as well as ground combat. We've become used to that as well in recent years. We're almost certainly going to face more than one adversary, if you define an adversary as an opponent in a contest, conflict, or dispute, or rival, a person or thing competing with another for the same objective or for superiority in the same field of activity. And these multiple actors will defy easy categorization, and they'll range across a spectrum of state, proxies, state-sponsored, state-supported, and self-interested parties. Our most likely adversaries will be decentralized organizations, and they'll have a high rate of adaptation. They'll employ Fabian tactics, choosing to fight where our technology is degraded or ill-suited, and our legal obligations are most constrained. In terms of modus operandi, they will have the home advantage, knowing the people on the ground better than ourselves. Whilst defence engagement will go some way to alleviate this, it will not fully cover this gap, nor be established in all instances. Our adversaries will almost certainly seek to deny us the freedom to deploy, operate, and sustain our forces at the local, regional, and potentially global level. They will not, or almost certainly not, wear an identifiable uniform, and they will almost certainly choose to operate in populated areas and complex terrain to reduce our advantages and enhance theirs. Taking all that into account then, how should we operate? Well, that's the big question that is going to be taxing the Army and indeed all land forces as we move forward into the next epoch. And the key point to highlight here is that we will be operating within substantial constraints. And understanding the legal framework in order to minimize our constraints is a key output of today's discussion. Now, a lot of those conclusions there, how should we operate within the environment and threats that I've spoken about, are things that are pretty obvious. I mean, it seems as though all I'm doing is spouting stuff that has come up in other conceptual work that's been done either at the joint level or indeed at defence or international. But we've done also quite a lot of other work in terms of experimentation within the Army headquarters, building an evidence base, as Brigadier Simon Deakin mentioned earlier, to define the Army's way ahead. And what I'm going to cover now is just a very brief slide, really, on what does this mean for us as we move into the next 20 or 30-year time frame? Well, first, I think we need to understand how we're going to overcome a relative lack of mass in future. I mean, traditionally, we've had a lack of mass. The opponents that we've faced since the end of the Second World War have clearly been numerically superior to us, and as a result, we have relied principally and traditionally on technology, on which I will cover a little bit more in a moment. But increasingly, we're attempting to compensate for a lack of mass through things like involvement in coalitions, employing pseudo-military forces. And within those forces, I refer to the private military and security companies, as well as, most importantly, really for the Army 2020 construct, contractors to deliver some of the capabilities that we have historically had delivered by servicemen in uniform. We're developing indigenous partner forces. That's nothing particularly new, although it's relatively new in terms of conventional forces. But we're developing those partner forces either pre-conflict or during conflict. Now, pre-conflict clearly relates to the upstream capacity building work that is the subject of the focus on defence engagement. And the questions that we have here are, to what degree, for instance, are we responsible for the actions of these partners when they are delivering the effects that we are teaching them to do? We're employing proxies. The Libya model is the good example of that. It involves a loss of control to a degree. We chose not to deliver a land component into the Libyan campaign, but to rely on a proxy force of government opposition sponsored by a degree of control that was not exerted by ground troops on the ground, but elsewhere. But in terms of technology, we are still retaining a technological edge in many areas, and I'm sure Jim will cover that in a second. We're moving away from mass effect, though, to precision effect, looking at the potential of things like unmanned and even autonomous systems to make the case for compensation with regards to lack of mass. In terms of autonomy, there is little legal oversight at the moment of the sort of things that we might wish to develop. And examples, developing defensive or more specifically offensive cyber capabilities, and understanding the degree to which information operations techniques can be used, particularly in a deceptive manner. Moving on to the second bullet point there are a plethora of issues that will dictate how warfare will develop, and over which we either have little or no control. Legal constraints will inevitably have a huge effect in many ways, but possibly not on our adversaries, as I think has been clear in the primer that Brigadier Stewart put out prior to this meeting. Some examples of this. Targeting. On the targeting side, I was fortunate to be a member of the team for Herrick 15, so I was in Afghanistan about a year and a half ago. And the thing that the brigade commander found most incredible, I think, during the tour was that it was quite easy to be able to justify the delivery of kinetic effect, precise kinetic effect on an individual in order to kill him if that individual was found to be a member of a group that one was able to target. But he was not necessarily able to message that individual, to be able to deceptively message that individual owing to the constraints that we had either placed upon ourselves or indeed read through our understanding of international law. So these were identified combatants, able to kill them but not to message them. Combat immunity, the degree to which we might be responsible for decisions and the way in which the Army may be responsible, for instance, for its procurement activities preparatory to operations in future. And detention, the degree to which we're able to detain individuals in a future operating environment. And I think those particular bullet points are just examples there of areas where we will have challenges in future. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Urban Warrior 5, because although this experiment that we've been running for a few months hasn't quite finished, it has thrown up a couple of interesting issues. The first one was that observation of the virtual experiment showed the company commander of the infantry company that was engaged in an urban operation against a peer and a non-state adversary. He was reluctant to employ the sort of high-resolution intelligence and surveillance assets that we have into an urban area prior to an attack, in case he found civilian present. It wasn't the answer that he wanted, because he wanted to be able to prepare the ground sufficiently for his operation. Now, clearly that wasn't a real operation. That was just an experiment. But, that raises concerns. And finally, we found that as we ran the models to determine the scale at which we required to conduct operations against a peer adversary in an urban environment, we found that we quite readily took a very substantial number of casualties in the early part of the campaign, and particularly in the break-in to the urban area. And the reason for that was that we were applying the rules of engagement that were quite constrained in a sense. That if one was looking from a Second World War perspective, one would imagine that it would be very constraining to the degree that operational success would not necessarily come from it. But we were alive to the sort of operational constraints that are now routine within the international environment that I've articulated before. So we played those ROE in the scenarios that we were doing, and found that we lost quite a strategic number of individuals. We then decided to relax them through the computer models that we were running, not to relax them to a degree that was contrary to international law, but to place them into a different perspective, and found that it had quite a substantial impact. And I don't want to talk any more about that now, but it raised the question as to how many casualties you need to take before you determine that it might be necessary to start taking the gloves off in war, and perhaps constraining yourselves less by policy whilst not constraining yourselves, whilst not being open to legal challenge. And I think that was something that came out quite readily. Now, as a result of really the Urban Warrior exercise, Operational Law Branch and us have been liaising on this for some time, and I think Brigadier Stewart's primer for this is an excellent summary of the challenges that we face and the things that we have been talking to him about over the last few months. And as I say, we're grateful for ISS for putting this together, and that concludes really my few moments. Thank you.
It's really spot on schedule as well. Thanks very much for that very useful overview. Touched on both technological issues and adversaries. So let's now turn to the first of those with Jim Maltby, please. See if this technology works.
Good morning. I'm Jim Maltby. I'm a Senior Strategic Analyst in the DSTL, the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, which is part of the MOD. We have about 4,000 scientists and engineers in DSTL, and we look at maximising the impacts of science and technology for defence and security. I'm from the Innovation Centre of the lab, which is called the Knowledge, Innovation and Futures Enterprise, and we conduct the horizon scanning, strategic futures, looking at emerging technology and long-term planning for the MOD and defence and security. What I'm going to talk about this morning is an overview of the technology trends, so I'm not going to give you techie details of the technologies and that sort of thing. I'm going to talk about some of the key technology areas, which you've got in some handouts in your packs, and then some key thoughts on how context and the adoption of technology and some of the overarching themes that are coming up from the work we're conducting at the moment. But before I go into that, I want to kind of set some broad context for thinking about technologies in the future. And one of the things is that people tend to respond to information on technologies based on already held views and values rather than basing it on rational assessment of the benefits and risks. And there's a massive examples of that out there, some of which are Einstein famously said there's not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will be obtainable. And in a military context, in 1904, Ferdinand Foch, a professor of strategy and later a Marshal Generalissimo for the Allied forces in World War I, said that airplanes are an interesting toy but of no military value, and he went on to develop the concept of air power. So we have a paradox in that we don't in DSTL and we can't predict the future, but we need to make some preparations for defence and security, especially in the military. We need to think long term and acquire equipment and things so that our soldiers, airmen and Navy are prepared for the future. So we need to base our preparations on history and hindsight, but we need to also recognise that history doesn't repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme, and that's what we're trying to do here is identify where those rhythms are. So to talk about technology in the broader sense and how the UK government thinks about it, last year there was a large cross-government review of horizon scanning led by John Day, who's the chair of the JIC. And one of the key things that came out of that was a key area of interest is emerging technology, and this supports the UK growth agenda. And it's meant that there's a great deal of ministerial and official interest in emerging technology. But the review has really coordinated and brought together some of the cross-government action. But before that occurred, the MOD, the Business Innovation Skills, the Technology Strategy Board, industry and academia have been working together for a long time, trying to improve our ability to look at emerging technologies. And that's becoming more relevant today with the change in the agenda and the focus of government officials. And this work is feeding directly into some of the work we're doing at the moment for the Defence Strategic Priorities Department, which is led by Ed Ferguson, the one-star in MOD, and that's a series of paper that's providing evidence to the Defence Strategy Group and preparation for the evidence base for SDSR 15. So the information you've got in your packs is a list of 17 clusters of science and technology that we've developed at the moment, and then within there there's a list of 5 kind of headlines that brigade some of those technologies underneath, and those are the things that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is that our dependency on information will grow, and Tim started to touch upon some of those issues already. The world is becoming more interconnected, interdependent, and internet-enabled. So in terms of computing power, Moore's law says that every 18 months processing power doubles. So my phone in 2030 will be about 4,000 times more powerful at processing information than it is currently. And so that means it'll be a supercomputer, and it's that size. And there's proliferation of information which is turned big data. And so we need to have some way of making sense of that, which we're not very good at the moment. If we assess that we're going to get better and better at doing that, but we haven't really resolved that. If we can do that, it's going to provide us with great advantage, but it also comes with downsides, so that in terms of security, our ability to be covert and secret and hide from people is going to be diminish, and that might mean that in some cases it's the absence of information that indicates where we are rather than people being able to detect that information. But with this interconnectedness and dependency on all these interconnections, there's also vulnerability, not just in terms of the adversary's ability to disrupt what we're doing, but also that the way that highly interconnected systems work is they tend to break themselves and have massive consequences in terms of ripple effects of disrupting the systems that themselves. So the next area is the human's role will remain central but change. And what we're trying to say here is that human and military productivity is going to increase, and there's a number of things that are going to add to that. So we're doing lots of, there's lots of systems at the moment that are being developed that aid us. So we have robots that can mow our lawn, vacuum our houses, and Google cars can drive themselves. Commercial airliners can fly themselves pretty much at the moment. They just have pilots there to keep an eye on the systems. And the car industry's growing their interest in autonomous cars and things like road trains, because they can get more and more capacity out of the transport infrastructure that we have. In terms of our brains and getting the most out of our brains, in the US at the moment there's a huge tendency for students to use drugs to enhance their focus and get better grades. what does that mean for Sandhurst, Intermediate Staff College, and the use by military of those things, or just the people that we're recruiting if they're using those things to get the grades to be selected. There's computer brain interfaces which have already been developed. So some work by Kevin Warwick in Reading has done lots of this, and he talks about when we wake up in the morning, rather than logging onto the internet, we log onto the Intermind, which is rather mind-blowing. Then also our growth in behavioural science and understand how we think and how we interact with each other is growing. So potentially we're going to be able to be more productive collectively, to work better together, understand what each other are thinking as teams, and also our adversaries and the people, our allies that we're working with. Then there's the growth in medical sciences that are potentially going to enable us to live longer and have longer, more productive lives. So the next one is about the 21st century and our decentralized and distributed infrastructure. So at the moment we tend to rely on a big 21st century centralized model for delivering our infrastructure. For example, our power comes from big power stations, but we're starting to move towards renewable energy systems which are more localized, solar panels on our houses, wind turbines, that sort of thing, feeding power back into the power grid. And we've seen in African communities and developing worlds where they've leapfrogged technology like the copper wire straight to mobile technology, and that's had a great impact in their ability to communicate, and they've completely bypassed our linear evolution of communications. Coupled with this, there's proliferation of things like 3D printing, synthetic biology and nanotechnology potentially give the people the ability to produce things on a much smaller scale, so they don't need big industrial plants to produce things. And this lowers the entry barrier to people, and it's also not confined by geography. So more people across the world are potentially going to be able to produce material for their own needs and any things they want to do. So the next one is the science of the bizarre will challenge us. So we tend to be taken by surprise by new technologies, and we assess we're going to continue to be taken by surprise in the future. So there's things like cold fusion may provide our future energy needs. NASA are already planning how they might fit cold fusion systems into aeroplanes in 2050. So there's some indication the science are possible there. And the Americans have got these active denial systems using microwave technology in offensive action, but they've not deployed it. So there's lots of bizarre technology, and also not just new technology, there's the use of existing technology in new ways that might have cause us challenges in the future. And then the final one is about participative innovation. So the availability of online courses now means that where you live and your access to universities, you don't need to go to an Ivy League university to get an Ivy League education. You can now do it online. This enables lots of people constrained by geography and travel to build up their knowledge and skills that weren't available before, giving us a potentially more homogeneous world. And just to talk about some final points, one of the most important things is that it's not the technology themselves that really makes a difference. It's the adoption and use by people of technologies. So Custer had a Gatling gun in the Battle of Little Bighorn, but he didn't use it. That might have shaped what happened there. And context also changes things. So when my parents were young, drink driving was acceptable. Now you lose your job. The law hasn't changed, but the context and perceptions of what people see as acceptable changes. In the past, the military used to set the future and lead the technology edge. That's less so now. The commercial sector is moving much more rapidly than the military is able to advance, and this is creating a new and interesting environment. And as Tim said about the degree of control that we have over what happens is reducing. And one of the most interesting things is that as these new technologies evolve, quite often it's their first use that determines what happens from then on. So that shapes the legal environment, and it's very difficult to predict what happens and with the technology and the use of the technology until it's actually been used.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Ben.
The description of the adversaries that Tim Law gave made a lot of sense. I'd like to come up with some contrarian views, but can't. Now, I don't want to give you a lecture that simply reiterates what JFC Fuller called the constant tactical factor, that every improvement in warfare is checked by a counter-improvement. Of course, some of the counter-improvements could be legal. So I won't do that. And I'd be insulting your intelligence if I took examples of both sides seeking to gain and exploit both symmetric and asymmetric advantages in conflict, or how recent wars have shown that high-tech, expensive Western systems have been easily countered by large numbers of cheaper, lower-tech weapons, such as the battle between IEDs and armoured vehicles, or for that matter, Hamas's rockets versus Israel's Iron Dome. And I'm sure this is bread and butter to all the military experts around the table. So I want to use a different approach to stimulate thought and discussion, which came to my mind after I'd finished reading the position paper. What I invite all the military professionals to do, and the legal professions, is to think that they belong to a state that has an anti-US, anti-UK, anti-NATO, or anti-Western orientation, or at least has a defence policy that may require its forces to deter or fight countries that espouse the Western way of war, including countries that would be seen as proxies of the West or have been trained or equipped by them. So in the first category, you have countries like Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and indeed you have Hezbollah. And of course, in the latter category, you have the armed forces of Russia or China. So imagine yourself to be an army officer or a lawyer in the Ministry of Defence or the plans branch of the operational HQ in Caracas, Tehran, Damascus, Pyongyang, Moscow, or Beijing. What would you be thinking about? Well, I think the first thing you'd have on your mind is the Libya War of 2011. You'd observe that Gaddafi's regime would have been far more likely to have survived if it had better internal security capabilities, such as well-equipped, highly trained, politically loyal elite forces that could ruthlessly halt protests before they developed. You'd also conclude that UN Security Council Resolution 1973 gave important freedoms to NATO, which they exploited in an increasingly anti-regime manner. So you'd recommend that your government seek to prevent such a Security Council resolution being passed, and you'd seek politically to undermine the formation of any coalition against you. You'd also see the value of striking enemy infrastructure and homelands with conventional, unconventional and cyber capabilities, and also employing anti-access systems. And finally, you'd consider Gaddafi foolish to a decade before having voluntarily surrendered his weapons of mass destruction. You'd also note that Western interpretations of the law of armed conflict make legal some quite interesting strategic, operational and tactical gambits. For example, if you were in receipt of an armed attack by UK forces, it would be perfectly legal for your special forces or for criminals or terrorists who'd been temporarily inducted into your forces to attack the glamorous modern HQs at Northwood and Andover and kill as many people inside as they could, or to apply the same tactic to any forward deployed UK HQs or forces, including in third countries. You would, for example, also have read with great interest the recent article in last week's Washington Post, where US government sources were quoted as saying that some potential US military operations against Syria risked violating international law and also risked giving the Syrian President Assad the legal grounds and motivation to retaliate against Americans. The conclusion of that article was that some US actions would not be legal, but if they were carried out, there would be legal, defensive and retaliatory options available to the Syrian government. You would also note that the last decade of conflict had shown the value of the hybrid approach that combines state and non-state actors as well as proxies, and that on many occasions in the last decade, the West's so-called information operations had repeatedly been overtaken by insurgent or jihadist propaganda, in part because they needed to pay less attention to the truth, and in part because of the vast overhead of bureaucracy that Western forces appear to carry with them, including down to the lowest tactical level, thus making them slower to respond. Your skilled, motivated and entrepreneurial propagandists would exploit the proliferation of cell phones to capture any images of Western forces behaving in a disproportionate, insulting or heavy-handed way and quickly disseminate these images worldwide. At the tactical level, your military commanders and ideological commissars would seek to create conditions that invited overreaction or increased the chance of civilian casualties or abuse of detainees. For example, when you looked at the British campaign in Iraq, you'd probably conclude that the greatest errors were not those celebrated in London, or considered by many to be errors, the accommodation with the militia, or indeed Operation Charge of the Knights, but the greatest errors were Camp Breadbasket and the death of Baha Musa. And you would fervently hope that any Western opponents you had were as ignorant of the law of armed conflict as British forces appeared to be in those two disgraceful incidents. You'd also note the way in which the Iraq and Afghan wars rapidly became unpopular. But you'd also note, particularly if you had some historians around you, that the anti-war movements in the last decade in the US and Europe were in many respects less well organized than the previous century's anti-nuclear movements in Europe in the 1960s and 1980s. And they were less well organized and less effective than the opposition to the Vietnam War in the United States in the 1960s. So you'd wonder if your diplomats or intelligence services could find ways to encourage or even discreetly fund them, if necessary, through third parties. This might not even exclude funneling aid to victims or to law firms that supported them. You'd also be bemused, amused and encouraged by the apparent inflexibility and glacial slowness of Western legal systems. You'd wonder, for example, why navies such as the British and US that had once swept the seas of pirates, many of whom being speedily subject to due process and executed, including 3 miles downriver from here in Wapping, you'd wonder why those navies now appeared so inhibited in the way they handled captured pirates. You might deduce from all of this that this gives you options to use countries' own laws against them, both the actual laws or those occasions where they actually forget their laws, such as Baha Musa or Abu Ghraib. And you'd hope to achieve the same effects that the Lilliputians did when they tied Gulliver down, each individual rope being no thicker than a piece of cotton, but eventually totally immobilizing Gulliver. And even if you were faced by Western forces that were properly educated and trained to conduct their operations in accordance with the law of armed conflict, you would hope that the understanding of this was less clear in their parent defense ministries and in the minds of their ministers, their attorney generals and prime ministers and presidents. And you would also hope to exploit a general ignorance of the law of armed conflict among Western journalists, media, and many of the usual talking heads. It might encourage you, in fact, that sometimes Western governments appear to be governments of lawyers, by lawyers, and for lawyers. Well, I thought some of you would appreciate that cheap shot. But actually, you'd wonder if this gives you a strategic advantage that could be exploited. For example, many Western commentators attribute to the Chinese forces a concept of lawfare. That is, they don't accept the idea that international law is intended to codify norms and rules that are acceptable to everyone, but that international law is a realm of conflict in which unilateral advantage is to be sought, no different in principle from that of diplomacy or the use of armed force. So the use of international treaties and legal claims are not to advance international peace and security, but rather to weaken the ability of the opponent's position and their ability to resist in conflict. Now, you can see elements of this strategy in China's use of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, to contest what the US considers to be legitimate and routine naval operations inside China's exclusive economic zone. And they also can be seen to be using UNCLOS to assert or reinforce disputed claims in the South and East China Seas. But of course, sitting where you are, remember in this Ministry of Defense in Tehran or Caracas or Beijing, you will have also watched the disputed international interpretation of the legitimacy of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and how some Western countries use the concept of international law to challenge US and UK legitimacy in the Iraq War. And also to see how some, for example, some US and Israeli officials have become targets of international lawsuits, and how international law is increasingly used as one banner in the campaign against the detention center at Guantanamo Bay. Now, this, of course, requires institutional ambivalence and even hypocrisy. But sitting in Pyongyang, Tehran, Moscow, or Beijing, you would reflect that the limited nature of democracy and accountability in your country made this less of a problem than it is in Washington or London, if you see it as a problem at all. And finally, if you were reading a copy of Brigadier Lithgow's paper that your intelligence service or cyber spies had obtained, you would wonder sometimes why the term advance in international law is being used in a British military paper, when quite clearly some of the advances in international law are potentially retreats or setbacks in terms of military capability. But once you'd finished amusing yourself in that way, the other thing you'd think is that this actually makes a lot of sense, and if you knew of this workshop, you'd probably hope it wasn't successful. But you'd also think, well, there's an information operation here, and the information operation is to discern ways and means of war, Western ways of war, that are going to worry you and disadvantage you, and use legal terms, legal terminology, to delegitimize them. Whether those terms are shoot to kill, a perfectly reasonable military term that became a major part of the IRA's information operation in Northern Ireland, whether it was death rays, itself a pejorative term, or indeed killer robots or Terminator drones. Plenty of opportunity here. That's it.
Thanks very much, Ben. So we've had three presentations, one that looked at the terrain, the threat, some of the operational conundrums, a survey of the technological trends that are, in general terms, affecting the operating environment or the environment in which all of us live, but which also involve potential and scope for innovation with respect to weapons, which creates new forms of vulnerability, some of which may require a legal response, and some of which may be anticipated by legal provisions. And we've heard from Ben how adversaries, both state and non-state, may seek to navigate their way through this new world in which we are living, and in particular try to exploit the tension that can exist from time to time between the requirement for proper legal provision and, on the other hand, the operational requirements that armies have. So we have now about 15 minutes or so for questions and comments. If you'd like to make an intervention, just raise your hand. As mentioned, we have people with microphones, so wait until they reach you. And when they do reach you, could you, for the benefit of everybody in the room, just give your name and affiliation before making your comment? First person catch my eye. Yes, you, sir, in the front.
Yeah, thanks.
You have a microphone, so...
Great opening, and thanks very much. Lots of food for thought. But the one question
So
that...
can you just identify yourself?
Sorry, can you hear that okay?
Yeah.
Colonel Eddie Corrigan, AD Concepts and Warfare Development for Combat Service Support. The point that came out of that for me was it's very much focused on a state-on-state, military, non-military adversary. But the last point that was made by Ben there was the notion that inflammatory language almost in itself fuels this kind of behavior, or it legitimizes some of this behavior. Where do we stand on other actors in this space, such as the press, the media, actually creating language which we find inflammatory, which we have no control over? And I use, for example, the term death squads, which a New York press or a journalist from the New York Times coined in Baghdad, which itself induced fear in the population and became a legitimate term as a consequence of his article, and that kind of control that we need to exercise over other actors.
There's a limit to how much you can influence the citizen journalists, but with regard to national and international news organisations, the question to ask yourself is how much you can achieve by briefing beforehand and explaining your logic. In my relatively new life as a talking head, I'm in receipt of some pretty random efforts by the MOD to do that, and there are considerable gaps within it.
Thanks, Adam. Just a comment, really, rather than a question, relating to the issue of the idea of potential adversaries or threats. This comes from Tim Law's discussion on the human environment. We talked about the localized communities becoming much more highly cohesive. The quid pro quo of increasing cohesion at lower level is a fracturing, if you like, of societies and states as these fracture points appear as more cohesion goes downwards. And this act of fracturing might in itself be the rationale for intervention, either under responsibility to protect or just simply the need to do something. The reality of this intervention in this kind of circumstance means that we are essentially intervening in somebody else's conflict. So it isn't so much us and them, it's them and them who are in conflict and we are intervening. And I guess the key insight is that all sides will then be trying to exploit our presence for their benefit. Some might elect to be allied to us for the benefits of our combat power and money in principle, and others might elect to oppose us because to do so would be in their interest. So it isn't so much a case of us and them. I think that sometimes in these kinds of conflicts, looking at it in those terms is less productive than understanding that actually we are an intervener in somebody else's conflict, which is far longer, far deeper than our understanding that could possibly be.
If I may, I'd just add that on the spectrum of conflict and possible UK and NATO operations, peacekeeping and peace enforcement hasn't gone away. In fact, you could anticipate that the demand for what you might call first-rate armed forces to get back into helping peacekeeping and peace enforcement may go up, and that increasing global instability driven by a variety of factors may also generate its own peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions. And that, of course, as many of us who've served in the Balkans will remember, can create an interesting tension between the mandate, the UN political and military chain of commands interpretation of the mandate, and the national interpretation, and then the multinational interpretation within a UK-led multinational contingent in that. And there are some well-known frictions that have occurred in the past, such as different interpretations of the use of lethal force to protect property, and I don't think we should neglect both the requirement for those potential operations, nor indeed the potential legal dimensions of them.
Okay, is that better? Tony Gillespie from DSGL. Coming back to the question of the press and journalism, I think there's one factor that was pointed out to me once by a Canadian, that there are three blocks of opinion formers that we have to recognise. One of them are the people that we as military have to persuade, the politicians, the lawyers who want to support us and so on, and certain sectors of the press who will always support our boys whatever we do. There's the hairy end of the extremists who you will never persuade. They will always put out stuff, and they don't always align with hostile forces. But there's a block in the middle who are relatively open-minded and think about these things in the long term, and they carry a great deal of weight with populations when conflicts occur, because the journalists have built up reputations which people accept and recognise. And so we as the military ought to make sure over a long period we actually give sufficient information about our problems and our understandings and the legal constraints we have, that when something happens, we're not suddenly rushing to persuade the journalists. We have a large block of people who will draw a conclusion on their own that we are actually acting reasonably, or actually giving us a warning shot based on long-term thinking that we may be at the edge of what we can do legally. So that's a point that's been made, and I haven't seen the evidence for that in the discussion so far.
Yes, just one question for Tim. Trying to urban warrior a question for Tim. Referring to the urban warrior deductions, you said that if the policy constraints on the company commander were reduced, it tended to lead to a situation where the number of casualties were themselves reduced. I think that's right. You said, but which is obviously a desirable outcome. But did the analysis go further in terms of assessing the likelihood of an enduring peace developing from? It wasn't that level of sophistication.
This was quite a
And in stark terms, what we're talking about is sort of moving closer to the legal parameters for incidental civilian loss than we have the existing constraints in current operations and such like. So more civilian casualties as the outcome, essentially.
It could,
yeah,
potentially.
I'm Dominic McGoldrick, University of Nottingham. I wouldn't worry about the press and the information people so much. I'd worry about social media. In quite a lot of countries now, nobody reads the Washington Post or the New York Times. They communicate only on the social media. And there's been some examples of where it's been used to kind of spread riots and revolutions, but I know during the London riots there was some evidence before the Parliamentary Committee that it was used in quite a sensible way to kind of public order terms to keep away from various areas. So I think social media is something you need to get you need to have a whole information strategy on, and if you are telling people about your operation via social media, the beauty of it in one sense, and the devil of it, is it's uncontrollable, but you can't stop people using it and they will spread the information. And from the negative side, it's very hard. It's also uncontrollable on the other side. You know, generally people are quite smart, and when they get the information, they will spread it and use it.
Well, I have to confess that I did actually tweet that this meeting was taking place today, but my intentions were not riotous or revolutionary. I can assure you about that. But Jim, do you want to say anything about social media?
I think one of the conundrums that we might have in the future is that if we have people like Anonymous or other groups that have some potential online to do some activity, if they're doing things that against some of our adversaries which we like, how do we support that? And even if it's illegal and doesn't fall within our constraints, can we harness that legitimately, or are we bound by constraints to try and cut off their action even though it provides us with benefit?
We've done a bit of work on this in the Institute, and certainly over the last couple of years we've looked at the role of social media, for example, in the Arab Spring. I was rather heartened on a visit to Kabul last month to see in the cavernous great joint headquarters at Kabul airport. NATO, buried away in one corner, has half a dozen or so desks of people that are monitoring Afghan social media to give near real-time pickup of things that aren't coming through the NATO chain of command. And I just say it clearly does offer opportunities to a military force. I mean, an example is the widely reported soundbite of the fall of Tripoli to the Libyan rebels, where when after they'd seized the headquarters of the Libyan mobile phone network, it went down, but it then came back up again, and everybody got a text message saying, "God is great, long live the revolution," and you've all got $25 free credit on your phones. Masterstroke, I think.
Thank you. Noam Lubel from the University of Essex. Just on the comments that were made with regard to use of the law and the way the law is seen by perhaps the other side, I think there's another aspect to this that we need to keep in mind, in that particular way of thinking is something that we see often also in the media here as well, and it has an effect, I think, of demoralizing the own troops amongst the general public, in terms of, we're constrained by all this law, it doesn't allow the forces to do what they need to do, it puts our own forces at risk, and so on. And I think there's a possibility to see it another way around, another spin to this, in that these laws are meant to reflect certain values, and they were enacted for those reasons. And it's mainly a question of perception, but by pushing that side of it, rather than look at all this lawfare that's used against us, instead it should be seen as, look, we're fighting on the right side. These laws reflect certain values, and even if we sometimes take a risk, even if we sometimes fight with one hand tied behind our back, that is evidence of us doing the right thing. So it's just sometimes a question of how one spins the law, and to another degree also it can be used against those same people that in whether we're talking about these certain states and so on, but the law is a tool against them in terms of accountability, if we're talking about international criminal accountability and so on. So just want to sort of put the other side of the way we see and use the law in another light.
Nice. Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say that's one thing I've always liked about the military, is in contrast, to the people I used to work for, they broadly do what they're told. Anyway, welcome to this second session on strategic trends in law relevant to land warfare. My name is Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk here at IISS, and as Ben Berry mentioned, prior to taking up that slot, I was the Assistant Chief of SIS, the UK Foreign Intelligence Service, and I think Ben asked me to chair this session because he knows that this is something that is very much at the centre of my preoccupations for slightly different reasons. I'm obviously not a soldier, and indeed I think it'd be hard to imagine anybody with a less martial demeanour than myself, but for certainly the past decade, maybe more, my former service found itself working with and providing intelligence support for what we learnt to call the Green Army, in an agenda that combined conventional combat operations with counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency in what has given rise to various types of hybrid conflict. And in doing so, we became involved in a range of legal considerations, and particularly around international humanitarian law, which up until that point had really had no relevance for the work that we were doing. And most people in my situation were vaguely aware that there was a thing called the Geneva Convention, but that was about as far as it went. But after 2001, we went on a very high learning curve indeed. And we had to do this learning in a situation where definitions of the law, expectations of how it applied, were undergoing considerable changes driven by a variety of both international and UK domestic considerations. Issues like the viability or the legitimacy of humanitarian intervention operations, the so-called right to protect, which I would argue is a concept that is coming under increasing international challenge as important emerging powers take issue with this concept, even though they may not necessarily explicitly say so. Within the UK, we've seen circumstances in which the judiciary has become more active in a range of issues to do with national security, an area from which, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the judiciary was largely absent, but now they are, very heavily engaged. And we've seen some important constitutional changes, as Professor Vernon Bogdanor points out in his book, The New British Constitution, the incorporation of the Human Rights Act, apart from potentially setting Parliament and the judiciary on a mutual collision course, has also had the effect of bringing together international humanitarian law and human rights law together in hitherto unexpected combinations. And I think one of the kind of philosophical policy issues underlying all of this discussions is the unresolved debate about the role of human rights in foreign policy and statecraft, what the BBC's Mark Urban referred to as an unresolved struggle between human rightists on the one hand and reality checkists on the other, which I think puts it well. And finally, as we heard in the last session, all this is happening in a world that's turned into a giant TV studio, and where activities and utterances are instantly captured, transmitted, and shape international debates in all sorts of ways. Anyway, enough from me. You haven't come to hear from me, so I will turn over to our two panelists, Professor Sir Adam Roberts and Professor Françoise Hampson. Their CVs are there for you, so I won't take up more time introducing them. Each of them will talk for half an hour, and hopefully at the end we'll have roughly the same period of time for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'll turn over to our first panelist, Professor Sir Adam Roberts.
Well, thank you very much, and I think the attendance today is testimony to the interest in the subject at hand, and congratulations to the operational law people, the Army, and to the IISS for putting this on. Our chair whispered to me in the previous session that nobody should talk about the law of armed conflict who hasn't been under direct fire himself. Have I quoted you roughly rightly,
I think so.
Nigel? Which puts me in a slightly uncomfortable position. I don't know about Françoise. We've both been to plenty extremely dangerous situations where bullets were flying around, but I don't think, unless I'm wrong, I don't think Françoise any more than I has actually been under direct fire. And perhaps I can confess to you for a degree of sympathy with the position of those who understand the use of force, sometimes finding the legal framework surrounding it difficult. My favorite sport is mountaineering, particularly rock climbing, and that's an area which occasionally does get dragged into the courts, just very occasionally, where a court has to determine, for example, whether a guide exercised a proper duty of care on an expedition where there was some fatality. And generally, I think the view among my colleagues is that this is not a suitable area for courts to make decisions. There are all kinds of difficulties in it, especially the lack of understanding of how decisions have to be made, again, in real time with limited knowledge, etc. So it's a similar issue, and I have some degree of sympathy with it. Now, I've been asked to speak about trends in law. I'm terrible at talking about the future. I remember once a student coming to Oxford wanted to write about the future of NATO, and my predecessor, Hedley Bull, said, "You can't do that. The sources on the future are very poor," which they are. And a particular issue that arises think about the future is there's always a risk in getting carried away with the belief that the future will be completely unlike the past, which it won't. There will be some areas where it is, of course, very different, and we've had them admirably described today, and I don't quarrel with what we've heard. But some issues have an enduring quality, and one that I'll come back to, for example, is the issue of treatment of detainees, and the issue of occupation law. These are questions that seem to survive changes in the sociology and technology of war, and which we ignore at our peril. In my remarks, I will allude briefly to human rights law, but because there's no doubt we've already had indications of this, that the implications of human rights law for the conduct of military operations are one of the most remarkable developments, and perhaps fateful, and needs to be considered carefully. But I will leave that to Françoise, except for occasional allusions to it where it's essential. And what I have to say, such as it is, and one has to cover this first of all, about the changing character of war, about what is actually changing. What I have to say really just complements what Stuart Lithgow said in his, I thought, admirable paper, which placed much emphasis on future land environment operations, and I thought covered it well, with one exception which I'll come to. Now, I just want briefly to underline the fact that the process of change we're in is not entirely new. To look at these graphs from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which I'm not a great believer in statistics about war. There have been many problems and problematic uses of statistics, but these ones seem to command acceptance across the political spectrum and pretty universally among academics. And what does it show? It shows in yellow the decline of interstate war. If you just look at that's between 1946 and 2011, process of decline of interstate war. It marks a really significant change in international relations that's been happening now for well over 60 years. Secondly, in grey, it shows a decline in what are called extra-systemic wars, which were in fact colonial wars of European powers. Thirdly, it shows in red the high incidence of civil wars. And fourthly, internationalized civil wars in black, and some increase in them. That's to say, civil wars in which an outside power or powers have become directly involved, including through participation of foreign troops. Now, this remarkable development in the nature of conflict, where international war has ceased to be the central preoccupation of publics, and I'm not saying that deterrence has ceased to be important, but the phenomenon of international war, that seems to be a rather enduring phenomenon, even though, and I emphasize this, there is no absolute guarantee that it will continue, not at all, and one can see new sources of conflict. Another approach to the decline in international war, and a very interesting one, is in Steven Pinker's extraordinary book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues that there has been a historic civilizing process among an extraordinarily wide range of societies, including dictatorships, where we've seen a reduction in certain forms of violence and criminality. And one can speculate endlessly about the causes of that, and he does interestingly in his book. But there does seem to be a process going on which might earn him, or indeed me, the criticism of being optimistic. But I have to tell you that the evidence is serious and suggests something significant happening in human civilization. Where there has been a significant increase in conflicts is in areas that you might call the post-colonial world. The predominant process in international relations since 1945 has been one of fission of states, where states have broken up, or empires have broken up into smaller groupings, and rather counterintuitively, that process of fission has led to an increase in civil wars and internal conflicts, and perhaps when you think about it, it's not altogether surprising. Just to clarify, the low incidence of armed conflict in Europe, in black at the bottom, the continuing pattern of violence in the Middle East in grey, which would have got worse since 2011, of course, because of Syria, the high level of armed conflict in Asia in red, and the high level of armed conflict in Africa, yellow, and then the relatively low level of armed conflict in the Americas. And I think a simple part of the explanation is, and in a sense a perfectly rational explanation, is that establishing order in post-colonial states is inherently very difficult. They don't have legitimate constitutional systems, legitimate governments, legitimate frontiers, legitimate ethnic arrangements between their ethnic groups. These things all have to be built up over time, and that these are enduring sources of conflict. We had much discussion this morning of whether violence by multiple actors or a range of multiple actors of a sort of sub-state variety against a wide range of targets was inevitable. I admire the speakers who made propositions of that kind for avoiding the use of the overworked term terrorist. But I have to say that I don't think it's inevitable that that will be the prime form of conflict. And terrorist campaigns have a way of working themselves out, of running into the sands when they fail to achieve their objectives. I remember once asking a head of your service, a previous head of your service, what was the accepted interpretation of why the huge wave of anarchist assassinations in the first 3 decades of the 20th century ceased. And he replied, we've looked at that very closely. He said, I don't know the answer. It's certainly not a simple case, but basically the failure to achieve success and the sense that terrorism is so last year, that was what they did in a previous decade, all of that may contribute to its ending, and police action and all of the rest of it. Now, a few thoughts about implications of these changes for UK land forces. I do think it's the case that most operations are likely to be, as they have been since 1945, in states that you can categorize as post-colonial one way or another. In many cases, these operations are likely to be under UN auspices. And I was interested in the exchange in the last session where Ben, I think it was, rightly said that UN operations may increase. UK has been somewhat reducing, in fact significantly reducing its involvement in UN operations because of its involvement in coalition operations in Iraq and elsewhere. But it seems to me highly plausible that whether under the badge of peacekeeping, which itself is changing character, or under the badge of UN authorized operations, it's likely to continue. And it's a striking fact that there have been literally dozens of UN authorized uses of force in the post-Cold War period, and there are likely to be more. And not just authorizing the United States, but France, Italy, the UK, many others. That seems to me to be, that's my one criticism of the admirable paper that we were given from Brigadier Lithgow, that there's no reference in it to the UN framework, which is likely to be significant in some cases. And not always are the mandates constraining. Some of the authorizations of force, the mandates have been found helpful, and they have changed when they needed to change. Not always, but sometimes. Significant trends in law relevant to land warfare. I'm going to refer to a number of issues that suggest difficulties. So perhaps I should start by saying that operating within the law has a number of patent merits. It provides a degree of legitimacy with the home public for what the armed forces are doing. It provides a degree of international legitimacy. It enables there to be common standards between coalition partners. And it's worth remembering, because law is so often conceived as a problem, it's worth remembering that the modern law of armed conflict began in the form of the multilateral treaty at the end of the Crimean War, the Paris Declaration, which was to put right embarrassingly inconsistent procedures between allies. That had been a problem in the Crimean War, and it sought to rectify that for the future. And that issue is, of course, the harmonization of issues between allies is still with us today. Now, a few problems in the application of law that I want to mention. Firstly, difficulty in applying existing law. We have seen the extraordinary problems in Afghanistan of getting agreed standards for how to treat detainees, who should have custody over them, and the like. That has been a running problem. We've seen a tendency for some operations to have such a character, and this was alluded to in the first session, as to make it difficult to take and look after prisoners of war. For example, the mobile columns, or they're not even really columns, but the mobile forces deployed by France in Mali, they were very small. They involved a very small number of personnel engaging in a very difficult role. That's the kind of operation where the taking of prisoners and the keeping of prisoners might be a problem, especially if there are difficulties in handing them over to the local government because it can't be trusted in the treatment of prisoners. So there is a problem there, not to mention the repeatedly encountered problem of the serious position of civilians in modern war. And that's become enormously emotive for a number of reasons. I happen not to believe the commonly asserted generalization that the majority of victims of modern war are civilians. I've looked at a number of conflicts about which that claim has been made, and it has not been true in most of them. There are some where it has probably been true, including, I believe, probably Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. But clearly the position of civilians is an enormously difficult one, where it isn't always universally understood that not every civilian death is a war crime. There may be all kinds of circumstances in which civilians die, and it is deeply unfortunate, but not a war crime as such. But that is one of the difficulties. Then there's the issue of the judicialization of the management of armed conflict. This was briefly alluded to in the interesting and important judgment of the Supreme Court last month in, I think it's a case fascinatingly entitled Smith versus the Ministry of Defense. But it's a very significant case, and Francoise may well be mentioning it because it relates to the application of human rights law. But so there is some recognition, even from judges themselves, that there is a difficulty there. But I have to say, having looked very closely at a number of cases at which the International Court of Justice has considered issues to do with the use of force, that courts aren't always the ideal bodies for looking at this. The International Court of Justice seemed unaware that the position it was taking on nuclear weapons, for example, in the advisory opinion, was actually a classic goalist position. They'd adopted a particular view of what nuclear deterrence was for, which was different from a UK or American view, and seemed unaware that they'd stepped into that particular minefield. There can be problems, therefore. And then there's the issue of lawfare, and Ben Barry was quite right to refer to the use of propaganda about alleged war crimes as a means of attacking intervening Western armed forces in various situations. And as if these difficulties weren't enough, we've got a situation now where the law of armed conflict, or the law relating to armed conflict, is so multifarious that countries have had difficulty in producing manuals covering it in a general, comprehensive way. The UK just got there with the publication of the UK manual, which was now some 9 years ago. It seems scarcely believable. And the United States has got into a difficulty on that, and the manual that had been prepared within the Pentagon with the approval of the armed services has now run into the sands in Washington, D.C. And if you want to have one view as to the causes of that and the difficulties between the State Department and the Pentagon, you can read an article published with today's dateline, Edwin Williamson and Hayes Parks, on Where is the Law Manual? Some questions at stake for Department of Defense and Legal Advisor nominees. And it's in the Weekly Standard and available on their website. It's a very interesting presentation of the problem. Now, I think part of the difficulty with the US manual isn't just a quarrel between the State Department and the Pentagon. There's also the issue that it's a document of great complexity. When you compare it with the manual produced in the 1950s, which was, if I remember rightly, somewhere around 100, 150 pages, you're then looking at a manual which would be well over 1,000 pages for the new one, and with far, far more footnotes. And that complexity is in itself a potential problem. Now, against this background, it may not be altogether a source of worry that there is evident difficulty in agreeing new law today. There have been at least 15, it depends on how you count, but at least 15 law of armed conflict multilateral treaties in the period 1945 to 2000, and more if you count each protocol of the Conventional Weapons Convention separately and so on. Since then, there's been relatively little. There's been some, the Anti-Cluster Munitions Convention, but and there's relatively little on the stocks. And some of the issues that people would like to see clear international law on are issues on which there would be particular difficulty in getting agreement. For example, drones. I think there would be extraordinary difficulty because when one great power, doesn't need me to tell you which, is very committed to their use, it's going to be very nervous about constraints on the use of that weapon. Another area of enormous difficulty where people would like to see agreement, but where I think it's improbable that it would have, as it were, a laws of war character, is cyber war. Possibly a more an area where there might be more scope for agreement would be over private military security companies mentioned this morning, where one can argue that they are already clearly covered by the existing conventions, but it might do no harm to spell out exactly where responsibility lies in such companies or with our national governments. Now, I'm running out of time, so let me just mention briefly a number of other topics, and I'll not elaborate on them. One is, and it's mentioned in the paper we have today, the unification of the law of armed conflict applicable in international and non-international armed conflicts. And I must confess here that I'm part of a study group set up under the auspices of this institute, which is looking at that issue. But I think it's an extremely difficult one, because we know that governments involved in conflicts against non-state entities are extremely reluctant to increase the legal burden on them in handling those internal insurrections or whatever. So it's a difficult one, and I believe, however, there is some very interesting practice in that area that does need to be studied and brought out that suggests that it's not hopeless. Another issue that arises from what I've said, and I'll just park it with you, is because of the complexity of the number of parties in modern conflicts, it's an interesting question whether the main reason for armed forces of Western states observing the law of armed conflict should not be seen as to do with professionalism, to do with their own internal discipline, and to do with reputation. In other words, the reasons for observance might not be wholly reciprocal, but to do with the ways in which an armed force sees itself and its activities. Finally, the range of problems that we undoubtedly face and that have been outlined this morning they do not mean that everything, including the meaning and application of the law, is up for grabs. Just because the world is rapidly changing and new techniques of warfare are entering in, new participants in warfare are entering in, it doesn't mean that the application of the law is up for grabs in all respects. Why? Because the law of armed conflict has always been selective in what it covers. It's not covering all aspects of armed conflict. One might wish that it did, but it does not. It covers specific issues, and particularly clearly, it covers the treatment of people who are in the control of an adversary power, whether they be detainees, prisoners of war, inhabitants of occupied territory, or whatever. And finally, I want to end by underlining what was said in the previous session, I think by Ben Barry, about the importance of sticking to the basics. He mentioned the Bahamusa inquiry, published in September 2011, nearly 2 years ago. Part 17 of that report made numerous recommendations to the Ministry of Defence, including some that bear on education and training, including in the treatment, of course, of detainees, which is what the case was about. I have to say, and I plead an interest, I was a witness to the Bahamusa public inquiry. I have to say that I think the report is exemplary. I think it's an extremely thorough piece of work, and it was accepted by the Ministry of Defence. And I think there are proposals there under its heading of general training, where there is still a need for action on the part of UK Armed Forces. And as a member of the Defence Academy Advisory Board, I've raised some specific questions about the adequacy of LOAC teaching in the ACSC at Shrivenham. Sorry, that's Advanced Command and Staff course. And I focused on the importance of imparting a firm grasp of the content of the law and how it relates to certain aspects of armed operations. And I don't think they have changed that much. So we must be alert to all the changes in warfare, alert to the changes in law, including human rights law, alert to possible future directions of the law, but none of that should be an excuse for forgetting the law we have, which deals with a discrete and important set of issues. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. We'll turn straight over to Professor Hampson.
Like Professor Roberts, I've got considerable sympathy for decision makers in conflict zones, but where I have no sympathy is with those who are opposed to accountability in principle. There should be accountability, but it needs to be based on appropriate standards. A lot of what you might have heard or read about human rights law is a load of rubbish, but some of what you've heard and read is true. Human rights law has an impact on your operations in two ways. First of all, it provides machinery through which other law is enforced. For example, in the case of Bahamusa, beaten to death whilst detained by British armed forces, that's a violation of the law of armed conflicts. Similarly, in the case of Karim Ali, if you shove a detainee into a canal when he can't swim and as a result he dies, that's a violation of the law of armed conflicts. It just happened to be enforced through human rights law. So what human rights law does in those situations is to provide a mechanism of accountability. And that's because no other means are available to the individual for securing accountability. They're having to use human rights machinery which is not best suited because there's nothing else. Human rights law, though, is also a substantive body of rules, and human rights law can trump other law which was previously applicable. The obvious example is possibly combat immunity following the decision in Rees-Smith. But I think we shouldn't get excited about Rees-Smith until we see what happens next, because we don't know the degree to which the decision will make a difference. My suspicion is it will make a difference to equipment generally provided, but won't make a huge difference to what commanders can do with the forces under their command. So human rights law is dealing with two different things. One's machinery and the other is substantive norms. What about the legal nature of human rights law? Because I understand that one of the concerns is that human rights law means the criminal prosecution of soldiers. That isn't strictly true in general terms. Human rights law is civil in character. It's a finding that the state has breached human rights law. But where the finding of a violation of human rights law concerns very serious crimes, for example, unlawful killings or prohibited ill treatment or a cover-up of unlawful killings, then the implication of the finding of a violation of human rights law will be the need for an investigation and criminal proceedings where appropriate. So sometimes the implications of a finding of a violation of human rights will require criminal proceedings, but human rights proceedings themselves are civil. Now I want to consider how human rights law works, and I think this will partly explain one of the major areas of difficulty for armed forces. Because just when you think you've avoided a problem with human rights law because you've decided that the killing was not an unlawful killing, human rights law rises up behind you and bites you in the backside. And this partly explains why. The first question, the one that is most likely to occur to you, is what's called negative obligations. That's, if you like, thou shalt not. Thou shalt not kill unlawfully. Thou shalt not subject to torture, cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. And that's what the man in the street, I suspect, would generally understand human rights law to be about. The bad news is that that is judged with the benefit of hindsight after the event. But in fact, that would be equally true if it were possible to bring civil claims directly under the law of armed conflict. It's a feature of legal proceedings. However, the law of armed conflict rules are cast in terms of what you knew, thought and predicted at the time. So there's an inbuilt way in which law of armed conflicts proceedings avoid being based on the wisdom of hindsight. Human rights law, on the other hand, on the face of it, generally is based on the result, not overtly on what you knew or ought to have known at the time. A bit of good news is that in practice, human rights bodies are aware of the risk of judging with the benefit of hindsight, and they do try to base their decision on what was known or ought to have been known at the time. An example of that is the finding that the members of the SAS in the Gibraltar killings case, that's McCann, that they didn't violate the European Convention on Human Rights. The negative obligation, the thou shalt not, is about the conduct of operations, what you did and how you did it. The second aspect of any human rights obligation is a positive obligation. It's an obligation to protect people from the risk of being killed or being subjected to unlawful ill treatment or to being disappeared. This has got implications for the planning of operations as opposed to the conduct of operations. They require, or human rights bodies appear to require, armed forces not only to consider when planning an operation the eventualities that may happen in relation to their own armed forces, but they also have to take account of the possible behavior of the opponent. The obligation to take precautions also affects choice of weapons. It also has implications for the provision of medical care, which is a question I'll come back to in a moment. Now, none of this is particularly alien to lawyers' use of the law of armed conflict, because in an armed conflict, at least an international armed conflict, you have to take precautions in attack to minimize civilian casualties. So the underlying idea isn't new, but some of the detailed decisions may give rise to difficulties. And that's because of an unfortunate tendency on the part of the European Court of Human Rights. In effect, they do a Lord Denning. They decide what they think the result ought to be, and then they arrive there. So, for example, if a human rights body, notably the European Court of Human Rights, thinks that overall there is a violation of human rights, but it doesn't want to get into a detailed analysis of whether there was an unlawful killing, because the implication might be that someone should be prosecuted and it's a difficult question. So instead of making a finding of a violation on that basis, or a finding of no violation on that basis, they choose to find some way in which the positive obligation was not properly respected. So, in effect, that means the state is responsible for failing to protect the right to life, but there's no necessary criminal conduct involved, so there's no need for a criminal prosecution. But the problem is that in displacing the real question, which was the negative obligation, in displacing it into the positive obligation, they actually may end up with inappropriately onerous obligations. One case where I don't think it was necessarily inappropriately onerous is McCann, the case I've mentioned, which is the Gibraltar killings case. The European Court of Human Rights did not find that individual members of the SAS who killed the 3 IRA members had violated Article 2 of the Convention. The violation they found lay in the planning of the operation, not enough was done to prevent the need to resort to potentially lethal force. One case where I think the upshot of shifting things from the negative obligation to the positive was balmy is the Gulech case against Turkey. The case involved an attack against a village, during the course of which a grenade was thrown through a window and it injured a little girl. The Turkish military knew they'd thrown the grenade, but they didn't know about the injury to the little girl. They gathered the population together in the village, dividing men and women, old men and children, and they actually asked for once, does anyone need medical care? The European Court of Human Rights did not get into the nitty-gritty of was the throwing of the grenade into the room a form of indiscriminate attack. Instead, because that would have been difficult, so instead they said, Turkey didn't do enough to see if anybody needed medical treatment. Well, they'd asked. So what are they supposed to do? Go up and lift up the dress of a little girl in the arms of her mother? That would not have gone down well in southeast Turkey. So this displacement activity can give rise to problems. The third level of obligation in every human rights situation is the obligation to investigate an alleged violation. This is interpreted as being an intrinsic part of the obligation to protect people from the risk of violation. And it forms part of the most serious violations, for example, unlawful killings, prohibited ill treatment, and disappearances. Now, we know in general terms what is probably required for an effective investigation, but we don't yet know specifically what will be required when you're trying to conduct an investigation in a situation of armed conflict. So the need to investigate the alleged violation means that there needs to be a positive obligation on the part of every member of the armed forces to report his suspicions and not to turn a blind eye. It ought to be, although there's no formal requirement yet under the European Convention, it ought to be a disciplinary offence to fail to report something. And certainly there's a command responsibility issue for commanding officers. But there's a real problem there, or potential problem, with the culture of not merely armed forces, the police would be in a similar position. And there's a real risk to morale if you know you can't rely on your mates covering up for you. That is a tension that must exist under the law of armed conflicts and not merely human rights law. The investigation has to be independent and impartial. That means there is no role for the commanding officer of the suspected personnel in deciding whether there's a need to carry on with the investigation, because he would not be accepted as being independent. The investigation needs to be thorough. Now, quite what that means in an environment like Iraq or Afghanistan is hard to say. It's certainly got huge implications for resources for the RMP. It's not enough to take statements simply from the personnel who were present. There needs to be some attempt to reach other witnesses. But I'm very struck by an incident in Iraq when the RMP went to try and to identify witnesses of an incident. People didn't want to talk to them. In order to get there, they had to be surrounded by British military personnel. They were all in uniform. Within 48 hours, a journalist from a British paper, turning up there not in uniform, was able to talk to the witnesses. So it made it look as if there was general information available that should have been available to the British Armed Forces. But in some cases, precisely because it's the British Armed Forces, it's going to be harder to get people to talk to you. There are questions to which we still don't know the answer about forensic capacity in the law of armed, in the conflict situation, including perhaps the need for forensic ballistics. It's important to note that medics may be really important witnesses. Thinking of the Baha Mousa inquiry, I would not like to have as my own doctor someone who failed to notice that Baha Mousa had been subjected to any form of ill treatment. Medics need to be told that they have an obligation under actually medical law. They can be struck off, as happened to the Baha Mousa doctor. You can be struck off for failing to report ill treatment, but they need to be willing to give witness statements. Where the investigation reveals that there is reason to believe that there was an unlawful act, then it must lead to appropriate criminal and disciplinary action. What's meant by appropriate includes the right charge, in other words, a sufficiently serious charge, and the right sentence. But beyond that, it's difficult to know exactly what will be required in specific conflict situations. There's also, as a matter of an independent right, a right to a remedy. In other words, an alleged victim of a human rights violation has to be able to secure redress, not necessarily through the courts. And the right to a remedy includes the right of the alleged victim to be kept informed of the investigation. So that gives you an idea of how human rights law works with these 4 levels of obligation. Next big question is, when does it apply? The easy bit is national territory. Where British Armed Forces are in foreign territory without the consent of the territorial state, then in cases of occupation, as defined by the European Court of Human Rights law obligations apply. It's not quite clear what the scope of human rights law in that situation is. I would suspect, on the basis of Al-Skani, that in the early days of an occupation, people will only be within the jurisdiction if they are foreseeably adversely affected by the acts of British Armed Forces. But eventually, if you are in a place for a long time and there's a certain measure of stability, you will have the full range of your human rights obligations, including obligations to deliver economic, social and cultural rights. That doesn't mean UK standards of welfare, etc., but it means the kind of things that you see covered by GC4, but we don't know to what extent the Fourth Geneva Convention will actually be used as the test. The key problems that are likely to arise in occupation are when you are dealing with an incident that is regulated by law and order rules, because the belligerent occupant has the obligation to maintain law and order, and when actually it's an incident to which the law of armed conflict applies. A second problem will be administrative detention or internment. A third will be the manner in which you conduct searches. And a fourth is likely to be control of demonstrations, and that's also going to be a big problem in relation to peacekeeping operations, because the police are the ones with more experience and the right equipment for controlling demonstrations. You shouldn't be using live ammunition. The second situation in which human rights law will apply outside national territory is to detention. Anybody who is within the physical control of members of the British Armed Forces, whether they are in a military base or not, will be regarded as within the United Kingdom's jurisdiction. That means they're entitled to human rights protection, but the scope of it isn't clear. We're not talking about educational rights that you might have in the United Kingdom, but certainly the prohibition of ill treatment will apply. The detention regime, the legal authority to detain, the grounds for detaining, the possibility of review of detention, that's going to apply, and it's possible that there may be human rights issues regarding contact with the family. But if one considers British Armed Forces in foreign territory without consent, and I'm not including a Security Council mandate, apart from occupation and detention, it's not clear to what extent human rights law applies in other circumstances, but it will become clear probably within the next 5 years. So keep an eye on the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in Georgia, Russia number 2, where amongst the many issues the court will have to consider is, one, whether Russia was in occupation of South Ossetia for European Convention purposes. It will also have to consider to what extent Russia had human rights obligations in what one might call Georgia proper. What if you're in foreign territory with the consent of the territorial state, for example, Afghanistan and later on in Iraq? One thing that has not been adequately thought through is that a foreign state can only authorize you to do what it is authorized to do. In other words, when the UK Armed Forces find themselves in a foreign state with consent, they have to act in conformity with the territorial state's international legal obligations, including human rights law. And even if the state itself does not respect its own human rights obligations in practice. In other words, you need to check what Afghanistan has ratified, and it may surprise you to learn that it includes the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. At present, I think that any form of proceedings, you'd only be affected by indirect proceedings. For example, a human rights monitoring body like the Human Rights Committee may ask Afghanistan, when it's reporting, what it does to ensure that states assisting it act in conformity with its obligations. I predict that within the next few years, it will be possible to bring direct proceedings against the assisting state, saying that you've got an obligation not only to respect your own obligations within certain limits, but also to respect the obligations of the territorial state. So one lesson to learn from this is, first of all, if you're going to get involved in an operation in a foreign territory with consent, do your level best to make sure that the territorial state derogates under human rights law, and secondly, that it's got appropriate domestic law, for example, on internment. The next issue is, how does human rights law deal with situations of conflict and the possible applicability of the law of armed conflict? This is very much work in progress, and again, it's an issue that will be addressed in Georgia Russia number 2. The first possibility is that there will only be a violation of human rights law if there's a violation of the law of armed conflicts. When might that apply? I think it will probably apply to most but not all issues in international armed conflicts, not including occupation. And to some extent, I think it might apply, but not to the same extent as in international armed conflicts, to high-intensity non-international armed conflicts. In other words, for the lawyers, a situation that's covered by Additional Protocol 2. A lot is going to depend on how well and how realistically cases are pleaded, in that it's up to governments to explain in a reasonable way why this kind of rule should be applied in the way in which they're proposing, not simply asserting it. For example, I wonder how easy it would be for lawyers representing the UK government to know about and then use the information we were given in the first session about the urban warrior experiment, and the fact that you can now demonstrate that proceeding in one way means you get more casualties in the long run than proceeding in another way. Because that kind of information could be really useful to those actually doing the pleading, but I suspect that it would never surface in a court in practice. The second possibility is that the human rights body will take account of the situation of conflict, not the law of armed conflicts, but the fact that the facts occurred against a backdrop of conflict, and they will apply human rights law with some flexibility. The European Court of Human Rights has done that. For example, they've done it with regard to decisions that Russian forces have taken in the Chechen conflict with regard to opening fire and the means that they chose to use, i.e. airstrikes. And they also, in the Moscow theatre siege case, showed a certain flexibility on the analysis of the alleged violation of the prohibition of unlawful killing. But in those cases, they did then find a violation of the positive obligation. So they didn't find that the killings were unlawful, but the failure to protect people, or the failure, in the case of the Moscow theatre siege, adequately to inform medical personnel as to what was going on, that did represent a violation. So when will the flexible approach apply? I think it will apply to any situation in an international armed conflict where they're not actually using the law of armed conflict. And I think it will apply where you've got a high-intensity non-international armed conflict. What is going to be problematic is the situations that are only just across the threshold for the applicability of the law of armed conflicts. A classic example would be Northern Ireland, where the Foreign Office said it was never an armed conflict, but where the view of the Army Legal Service was at certain times in certain places, it did cross the threshold of Common Article 3. Now, in that kind of situation, a low-level non-international armed conflict, I think there is a reasonable likelihood that the European Court of Human Rights would only apply the normal rules unless there was derogation. Now, I've put at the bottom there, query the impact of derogation under human rights law. Derogation is a means by which a state can modify the scope of its human rights obligations, particularly in the area of detention. You have to show that there is a war or other public emergency threatening the life of the nation. You have to show why you need to derogate and which normal rule you are changing. So it means you have to be able to present them with another rule you're going to apply instead. But derogation raises a range of questions when you're considering the possible use of the law of armed conflicts. The first is it possible to invoke the law of armed conflicts if you haven't actually derogated? I think, as a matter of principle, it would be possible to seek to rely on the law of armed conflicts, but it would certainly be more credible if you've actually derogated. There is no tradition of states derogating in extraterritorial situations, but I think they need to start doing that, and I suspect that after Al-Jeddah, the UK probably will start thinking about that seriously. I don't know what the effect would be on the use of the law of armed conflicts of invoking a derogation. I think it would mean that the European Court of Human Rights would be more willing to take into account the situation of conflict and possibly would be more open to reliance on the law of armed conflicts. What about human rights law and reasonable expectations? So what's going to crop up when? First, in law and order operations, including law and order operations that arise in a situation of conflict, because not everything that goes on in an armed conflict is regulated by the law of armed conflict, then there's going to be an assumption that you will use the normal law and order type rules. Strasbourg has got a distinction between pre-planned operations and ones where they just emerge out of nowhere. In the case of pre-planned operations, then they're going to look at the actual conduct that is engaged in as part of the planned operation, and they'll subject that to tough scrutiny because it was part of the plan. They will, to some extent, expect you in the planning process to take account of unexpected developments, but they'll show more flexibility there. Where what happens is that you're proceeding, for example, not expecting any armed opposition, you're moving from A to B, and a clash suddenly erupts out of nowhere, they will show significantly more flexibility than in any other situation. Human rights issues, it's fairly obvious what the list is: killing, injuring, ill treatment, including the obligation to provide medical care, internment, search and the way in which you conduct it, privacy, which is important for information operations, which Professor McGoldrick will be dealing with this afternoon, policing demonstrations, which is a big problem in UN missions, possibly controls on media output and freedom of expression, destruction of civilian property. A lot of the cases against Turkey from southeast Turkey involved, amongst other things, compensation for the intentional destruction of homes. And you're not allowed to discriminate between different groups. That means an unjustifiable difference in treatment. It doesn't cover the justifiable differences in treatment in the exercise of rights. So where are the practical problems? I think the whole issue of investigation and the obligation to report, command responsibility in relation to the obligation to investigate, that is a big practical problem that needs to be seen as part, I think, of the Baha Moussa agenda. Similarly, the issue of investigation as a result of Al-Skani, there are going to need to be changes in how investigations are conducted, and what makes it a little difficult is I don't think it's completely clear how much is expected. And I think there is a risk that if you go overboard with regard to the investigations, this will disrupt ongoing operations and may have serious effects on morale. So that needs to be taken into account, not so that you don't investigate properly, but somehow that you mitigate that risk flowing from the investigation. As far as administrative detention in extraterritorial NIACS, I think that law needs to be issued. I've put law in inverted commas because I don't necessarily think this means traditional legislation. And I don't think the Copenhagen process goes anywhere near far enough. I think what needs to happen is the UK needs to produce something and it says we are bound by that. It should recognise that under customary humanitarian law you can engage in internment in in any non-international armed conflict, that the grounds for internment would be the grounds set out in Geneva Convention 4, by analogy, and then it should use human rights law to identify the questions that need to be asked, but give a practical answer. So you come up with a code of this is what we're going to do. In that case, you derogate and you rely on that as the law that you're going to apply. And since one advantage of our strange constitutional monarchy is that there is the possibility of things like orders in council. You don't have to shove everything through Parliament in order to get law, so we might as well exploit that opportunity. And do keep records. And records need to be kept even when you leave theatre. They may need to be kept for 20, 30 years, as experience from Northern Ireland has shown. Where are the main legal problems? The first one is we don't know what the scope of the extraterritorial applicability of human rights law is, but that is going to be clarified sooner rather than later. And I think the next issue identified there is actually a really big problem, and it does not stem from human rights law. It stems from the law of state responsibility. Under the law of state responsibility, there are circumstances in which a state may be responsible for the conduct of persons who don't belong to the state. So when is the UK legally responsible for the conduct of others? I think it will be freakishly rare for acts of non-UK personnel to be attributable to the UK. That would mean that the UK was in effective control of those forces. What I think is going to happen much more often is that the UK will be found itself responsible for failing to prevent the acts of others. That could arise in the mentor-mentee relationship, it could arise in joint operations, and it can arise simply because you're present at the same time. What is expected is going to depend on the facts. Were you in a position in practice to prevent what they were doing? Well, that's going to depend on how many there were of you, what kind of equipment you'd got, how many there were of them, and so on. But I do expect this to be a really significant legal problem in the next 10 years or so. Does respect for human rights law matter to the military commander? Yep. For the three reasons of perception, all of which feed into legitimacy, it may be necessary in order to keep a coalition together. For example, in the Gulf War 90 to 91, there were all sorts of things that could have been done, that it would have been lawful to do, but which weren't done because of the need to keep the coalition together. Also, I think that respect for the rules, in addition to reflecting our own values, it actually reduces successful use of lawfare by your opponents if you are demonstrably acting in a transparent fashion and willing to accept accountability. So I don't think that human rights law is an insuperable problem, but I think there will be difficulties along the way. It's mainly a matter of ensuring that you investigate alleged violations, but in addition, we've got to sort out when the UK is going to end up being civilly responsible for the acts of others. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Two very, very rich and substantial presentations. We've got about 20 minutes for comments and questions, and I see the cavalry has just arrived in the shape of two people with mobile microphones. So same rules as before. Please wait if you need to for a microphone to reach you, and please identify yourself before raising your question or comment. And it'll take a moment. Yes. Sorry.
I spoke earlier, Colonel Tim Law from Army Headquarters. You mentioned there about, and the last slide but one, or the slide before the last, was the important one from my perspective, that the UK could be held responsible for failing to anticipate and prevent the acts of people whom we mentor, which obviously could be significant. My question relates really to the Libya model that I mentioned earlier, the way in which the European coalition chose not to deliver a land component into that particular theatre of operations, instead relying on an indigenous opposition, legitimate or otherwise, and a collection of groups. What are the legal implications for the UK of really playing a part in an air and maritime campaign, but not in a land campaign, and then seeing difficulty arising from that inactivity in the land environment?
First of all, I don't think there is any question that the UK would have had the acts of the Libyan fighters on the ground found to be attributable to the UK. It's only a question of was there any responsibility to prevent violations by them. And the scope of any responsibility would very much depend on the facts. In that situation, if you did absolutely nothing when there were allegations of ill treatment of detainees, for example, then the failure even to raise concerns with them, I think that would possibly be a basis on which the UK could be responsible. If the UK had raised concerns and raising concerns made no difference, then there might have been a question of what next. I wouldn't have thought there could be much more in the situation in which you found yourselves. There couldn't be much more than some sort of offer of training or offer of some sort of little code, you know, a kind of card, so that they would have rules on how you do it. So that it's going to be anything like as intrusive as the UK's responsibility for the acts of UK forces. But there could have been some, but it's not that the acts would have been attributable to the UK.
Okay, gentleman over there.
Yes, Darren Stewart's my name. I'm the Chief of Staff of the Army Legal Services. A question to Sir Adam and to Professor Hampson. First to Sir Adam, I was struck by your reference that things don't seem to change significantly in terms of looking to the future with respect to reference to past experiences. And in relation to detention in particular, I thought when you made your reference to Mali and the use of light mobile forces, one could think of the Long-Range Desert Group in North Africa in the Second World War. And I was just curious as to whether you think now there is a higher standard in relation to treatment of detainees than perhaps may have existed in that particular conflict, which suggests that tactical airlift may be a means which now has to be used to get rid of or remove those detainees from a location, as opposed to in the past perhaps leaving them with some water and allowing them to get on with best efforts. Professor Hampson, a two-part question. Firstly, if you have a court that is quite significantly politically motivated like the European Court of Human Rights, and one looks at the recent Al-Scaini judgment, in particular the judgment of the learned Maltese judge, with respect to its comments, and indeed your reference to the fact that they tend to want to find states accountable and reverse engineer from that particular standpoint to find accountability, is derogation going to matter? And is it going to have any effect? Will the court find a way around it, notwithstanding that? And secondly, on the question of state responsibility, I assume you're referring to Article 16 of the International Law Commission's draft articles. And if so, how do you see the mechanisms for that aspect of state responsibility coming into play? Through which sort of courts? Secondly, what sort of standards will they apply? And there's a reference in the articles that refers to knowledge of circumstances. Would that include if we had embedded staff within a headquarters? Does it extend that far up the chain? And in terms of mentoring and joint operations, how does that impact where you have two bodies of, even though very small, armed forces operating beside each other, and a positive obligation to intervene when the others are perhaps performing in a certain way which might breach either their obligations or the obligations of the accompanying forces? Thank you.
We'll take them in the order they were presented, so Adam first.
Thank you, Darren, for that. And your asking that question reminded me of the occasion when you held a conference at Rheindalen on Afghanistan, and one of the issues we considered there was treatment of detainees in Afghanistan, and another was targeting. And I think it's fair to say there was a view there that the conduct of air operations could be completely different from previously, in that they could be held to a higher standard through even a higher standard than Protocol 1. And I recall the aim being expressed by some there that there would be there should be zero civilian casualties in Afghanistan. And we're all a bit sadder and wiser now about that, in that for all the known reasons, and despite considerable efforts at discrimination and all of the rest, there were many civilian casualties of air operations in Afghanistan. Now, to answer your direct question about detention, you can see where I'm going, that it's very easy to believe we're in a superior environment where we can do things better than in the past. I don't actually think that we have now achieved higher standards in respect of detainees than prevailed in the past. They were very varied. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were not in the past, and the same is roughly true today. And so I'm afraid I'm slightly ducking your question on that, other than to say that of course it is the case now that if there is poor treatment of detainees, which has always been a highly emotive issue, even in the 19th century, many cases of detention were highly emotive. But nowadays, the news of alleged horrors in the treatment of detainees spreads very widely. And so it becomes more important to hold ourselves to a reasonable standard than perhaps it was in the past.
I don't accept the generalised form of your specific comment about the Maltese judge, but I'm not disputing the validity of the comment in relation to him. I don't think that it's the case that the European Court of Human Rights has some sort of agenda, including during armed conflicts. Its track record in dealing with derogation has been pretty responsible. In the case of Northern Ireland, where the UK initially tried to claim it didn't need to derogate with regard to long periods of detention, lost the case, derogated. They then agreed that this was a situation in which the UK could derogate, and it wasn't an unreasonable derogation because of the extent of safeguards. When Turkey derogated with regard to the situation in southeast Turkey, again with regard to detention, there the problem was that not even that Turkey didn't provide any safeguards, but actually it was authorizing detention for 15 days, renewable automatically for another 15, and they found that to be too long. So invoking derogation has made a difference. In practice, the cases they've dealt with have all concerned Article 5 on detention. The one time a state sort of derogated across the board was the case of the Greek colonels, where they just said they were derogating with regard to all relevant provisions of the Greek constitution, which made it a little difficult for Strasbourg to know exactly what they were derogating from. But there's no reason in principle why you can't derogate from other potentially derogable provisions, but you're going to have to explain why. In other words, why you can't apply the normally applicable rule and how precisely you propose to modify it. But I don't see why that couldn't work. On state responsibility, I think the first way in which this issue will surface, the question of the need or the responsibility of a state to do something about wrongdoing by another state, I think it will first surface before human rights bodies. And that's because they've all got this sense of there being a positive obligation. They already read into human rights law the obligation to protect people from things. Well, that includes the obligation of a state to protect the right to life against harm at the hands of third parties, not just the state, for example, the case of Osman and Osman. So I don't think it would be a surprise for human rights bodies to get into it that way. With regard to what it is they would expect, it's going to be hugely situation dependent. So if you've got one embedded officer, then maybe you might expect him to notify up his own chain of command so that appropriate things can be said to another chain of command. But he's hardly going to be expected to seize a weapon and to shoot dead all those who are engaging in the unlawful conduct. Even with regard to something more robust, then, I mean, if you've got an incident where, say, you've got 40 members of the British Armed Forces in a village working alongside the armed forces of the territorial state who are being trained, who are basically inept and don't know anything about any form of law, and are in the process of, for example, assaulting the women of the village and trying to get the children to act as child slaves. If the British forces did nothing in that situation, beyond afterwards saying, oh, well, you shouldn't have done it, I think there'd be a problem, particularly if it was something like 40 members of the British Armed Forces and 50, 60 of the opposition. So what will be required will be very situation dependent, and I don't think they will be unreasonable there.
Okay, thank you very much. Two questions there. I'll take the lady first and then the gentleman sitting next to her.
Hello, Cathy Braddock-Hughes. I'm from the Operational Law Branch. Could I put two questions then? I'm sorry to do them in a double session. Leading on from the point you've just made, Professor Hampson, if we are looking out in Mali, where we are providing a training mission specifically for the Malian forces, or alternatively where we have Libyan forces coming over here, which we're engaging with training on, where does our liability then lie for incidents that occur? That's question one. The second one is more to do with turning Smith on its head, not just about our combat immunity, but if we have technology available which will reduce the casualties that we cause, such as the iStar assets, which actually UK PLC doesn't necessarily have a great deal of. If in future conflict environments, because of the cost implications, we do not use those assets and we therefore cause casualties, under Smith we could have provided that additional level of protection. Could we be looking at further liability there? Thank you.
On the first issue, I mean, unless you're actually training them to commit war crimes, and there was an issue that, for example, the CIA manual in one of its editions that was used in the School of the Americas was actually getting them to break the law. But on the assumption that the British Armed Forces, about which I'm confident, are not training them to do anything of the sort, if they subsequently disregard the training they've been given, then there would be no responsibility on the part of the United Kingdom, assuming they're doing all that on their own and there aren't any British Armed Forces deployed with them. If there were British forces deployed with them when they go back having been trained, then the issue would be like the one I addressed in relation to Darren, and it would depend on the facts. With regard to Smith and the issue of resources, I think that the courts are used and are getting increasingly used to not being stupid. That on the one hand, if there is something that would make a significant difference in relation to casualties and which would not be hugely more expensive than the thing currently deployed, then yes, they might expect that to be used. But they're not going to say, for example, you can never use any bombs other than laser designated bombs or precision munitions. They're not going to get to that stage. So there is going to be a reasonable balance struck. And I think it'll be very interesting to see actually what the courts do now they've got the steering from the House of Lords, or sorry, the Supreme Court, in Smith, because I suspect that whilst there might be an issue over Snatch Land Rovers, I suspect the issue for the commander in the field as to what it is he can do, then they're going to recognise what he's got and who he's got, and to say he's got discretion to use it. But that's just me speculating. But for something that's relatively minor with regard to equipment, yes, maybe, but not something that's basically means that you can't avoid getting into defence policy and economic policy.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. Noam Lubell, University of Essex. I just want to raise a couple of points that's come out of some of the comments that Professor Hampson made with regard to investigations in particular. And these are two issues that I think can cause real problems and are likely to cause real problems. when looking at the human rights perspective. The first is, what is the trigger for an investigation? Because you can clearly see also within the law of armed conflict that you have to have investigations when there appears to be, or there's a chance that there may have been a war crime. So under the law of armed conflict, you don't need human rights law for that, you need to have an investigation. But from the perspective of most of the human rights bodies, generally speaking, as soon as you see death of civilian, they expect to see some kind of an investigation. Now, from a law of armed conflict side of things, you can have deaths of civilians where clearly there has been no violation. Something is obviously and clearly proportionate, for example. So the question there is, will we see a situation where, under the law of armed conflict, you shouldn't have had to engage in an investigation, and the human rights body will say, well, yes, every civilian death now needs an investigation, and what type of investigation? And the other point is with regards to bringing civilians who have been interns, bringing them before military boards, which is again something which is acceptable under the law of armed conflict. Certainly in the Fourth Geneva Convention, it envisages situations of civilians being brought before military boards, but at least some of the human rights bodies have specifically said that you should never bring a civilian before a military board, and it should that automatically would not be independent and impartial. So I'm just curious as to whether Professor Hampson has some thoughts on both those points. Thanks.
With regard to the trigger for the obligation to investigate, I think that it's not going to be a matter of formally invoking the law of armed conflict. I think it's going to be a question of interpretation by a human rights body taking account of the situation of conflict. So, for example, if there is some big clash, and at the end of it, there are dead civilians, but there is no reason to believe that these weren't lawful, then I don't think they would necessarily see that as requiring an investigation. However, I think that in occupations, particularly where they're stable and settled occupations, then I think it's going to be much more like a law and order paradigm, and you'd have to investigate everything. So I suspect that the trigger, particularly if it's pleaded properly, the trigger in a situation of armed conflict is some reason to believe. So I think that would be it, but in occupation I think it would apply to all of them. As far as civilians coming before military boards, I am confident that if the case was pleaded properly, Strasbourg would have no problem with that. I think it would really help if you would derogate. It would help if the UK could point to some species of binding obligation where they said, this is the regime we're going to apply. But if the UK made it clear that in extraterritorial situations where they are interning people, that they were going to use a regime modelled on that of GC4, which very clearly envisages that civilians can be brought before some kind of military tribunal, I think that Strasbourg would accept it. But I think it needs to be pleaded properly. And if I may say so, on the basis of Al-Jeddah and Al-Skeini, I was appalled at the pleadings of the United Kingdom government. They lost those cases. It's not that the applicants won them.
Well, a question from over there.
Thank you. Bill Warren, I'm the Provost Marshal Army. Just on the investigation point, one observation and one question, if I may. I think there's some messaging to be done internally within Defence about investigation is still sometimes seen as a threat, if you will, to commanders and their subordinates, where really it's an opportunity to evidence sort of proper planning and consideration of any legal imperatives or obligations. And I think that message is beginning to gain traction. My question is about who can investigate, and I was pleased not to hear any criticism about the RMP being able to investigate, but I'm sort of opening the question up now. Because plainly there are some legal challenge to RMP's ability to independently and effectively investigate. And I wonder if we could explore whether the current situation of having a military police force as part of a deployable force with some protections in law regarding their independence is satisfactory, or whether Defence needs to take another step in that regard.
I completely agree about messaging. I think you do need to consider the impact on morale particularly not so much with commanding officers, because I think they have had the education and training to see the bigger picture, but I suspect that with squaddies, they think anything that puts an obligation on them to inform on their mates, getting across that an investigation isn't a threat, I think is an issue. And one thing you might want to consider is whether, where there's been an investigation and it doesn't result in proceedings, can you ensure that there's no mark of that on the record of the individual concerned? Because if something's staying on their military record, even if there are no proceedings brought, then I think that's unfortunate. On who can investigate, what is it about the army? Whenever they're dealing with lawyers, medics or police, the assumption is if they could do it, they'd be doing it in Civvy Street, therefore they must be crap. It does seem, I mean, you've got no reason for doubting the capability of the RMP. There may not be enough of them, and they may need some specific forms of training, and they may need to get scientific expertise that they can deploy in theatre. And for some things, it may be a matter of getting the evidence back to the UK for testing it, but I see no reason in principle why the RMP can't investigate things.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yes, one question from the end there.
Thank you, Charles Haraway, also linked to University of Essex, but also formerly Army Legal Services. Question for Francoise again on the trigger mechanism, following up what Noam asked. When one looks at the trigger mechanism from the point of view of the law of armed conflict for investigations, we do tend to look very much on the proportionality side. Civilians dead, is it proportionate? Yes, no problem. Is there a problem, though, because the human rights courts are increasingly avoiding the proportionality issue by looking at it from the point of view of the precautions in attack, if I may put it in LOAC terms? That is a different test.
I think the problem with precautions in attack is you can't convert it into a trigger. So you can't say, because I think they might not have taken precautions, therefore, which is going to make it problematic. But I think that if what you're analysing is a clash in an AP2 context or in an international armed conflict, then I think the trigger should be reason to suspect an unlawful act according to the law of armed conflicts. Where you're in a situation and you're not confident that the law of armed conflicts will be the frame of reference, then it's reason to suspect a violation of human rights law, even taking account of the fact they might apply it with some flexibility. And that means human rights proportionality, which is completely different. It's not just that it's stricter, it's based on different things compared to law of armed conflict proportionality. So I don't think precautions in attack will be a way out of it. It may explain what Strasbourg is doing in that they might well decide overall we think there's going to be a violation here, and then they're shoving it into precautions in attack. But if they actually have to identify what the trigger was for the investigation, I think they're going to have to do it in terms of some form of suspicion. We don't have clear evidence yet. We've only got Al-Skani. It's going to take more cases before we know exactly what the trigger is. But I think it should have been predictable that they would have required it in Al-Skani.
A question to both presenters. Sir Adam spoke of the judicialization.
Could you tell us who you are?
Sorry, Guglielmo Vedirame from King's College. Sir Adam was speaking about the judicialization of armed conflict, and Francoise spoke about human rights as a machinery for the enforcement of international law. So, since the theme of the day is the future, what sort of future trend do you envisage as far as judicialization is concerned? I suppose one possibility is that it is undone, but I think you probably agree that this is not a likely scenario. There are other countries like Israel where armed conflict has been judicialized for much longer and it still continues today. So we're probably going to continue to manage judicialization, but how should it be done? What do you think the more desirable scenarios are going to be? Is it going to be managed still through the human rights court system? In which case, should we perhaps instruct or educate human rights judges in Strasbourg, but also in the administrative court here? on the law of armed conflict, or should we perhaps consider setting up a separate mechanism of enforcement or a separate section in the administrative court? So what is, in other words, the more likely and also the more desirable scenario as far as judicialization is concerned?
Okay, I'll give that one to Adam Roberts first.
I think it is an ongoing process and likely to carry on. One reason is, amazingly, we've got through today with hardly a mention of the International Criminal Court. The consequence of the mere existence of the International Criminal Court is that there has to be a convincing internal system of investigating and prosecuting whenever there's an allegation of a crime under the International Criminal Court statute. I'm sure we all recall when the Act was before Parliament, the International Criminal Court Act, Tony Blair made the commitment, the promise that no British officer would ever appear before the International Criminal Court. I thought it was a pretty bold and surprising claim to make. But inasmuch as there is a commitment to avoid that, there has to be a convincing system at home. And so apart from all the other reasons, I think it's likely. Now, as regards how it might improve, firstly, I do think that courts themselves slowly learn, although it's not by an even or smooth process. But the European Court of Human Rights, in respect of the cases in Ireland, learnt, I think, a useful way forward, which in fact was found in some ways to be useful by the United Kingdom officers concerned with the matter. Inconvenient, perhaps, that it was being considered by a foreign court, but ultimately quite helpful. And the question arises as to whether, and I leave this to others to determine whether there are possibilities of it, whether there can be any assurance that judges dealing with cases of this kind at least have some clue about the very special circumstances involved in foreign military operations, so that people aren't being judged by those with no experience whatever of that. This is not a plea for military courts as such. They have their role when dealing with military personnel, but they're not the only way by which cases will arrive at court. But I think there is a case for some degree of expertise.
I agree with Sir Adam on the importance of the International Criminal Court. I think when one considers judicialization, there are two issues that need to be distinguished. One is as a means of securing accountability, and the other is applying standards, whether appropriately or not. And clearly, because of the International Criminal Court, there needs to be an effective accountability mechanism. And if the only one is through human rights law, then for that reason, it's going to need to be in that area. Certainly, judges need not merely academic training in the law of armed conflict, but sort of immersion. There was a time when I asked for permission from my colleagues for, before students did the exam in the law of armed conflict, if I could, before they started, if I could play them the last 20 minutes of Platoon, which is just noise and light, and then I was going to throw questions at them. I was told I wasn't allowed to do that. But I think that would be a good start for judicial training. Guillermo also asked about whether there should be some other specialized body. Quite apart from the issue of there being military courts, it raises the question of whether you could have an international court of the law of armed conflict. In other words, something like human rights machinery, but for the law of armed conflict. I think it's most unlikely that that will happen. I regret it because as somebody who is a litigator in Strasbourg, I would rather take an armed conflict case to an armed conflict body. But I think there would be such impossible problems of jurisdiction, and I think that at the moment it's just simply not the climate, as Sir Adam explained earlier, for getting new international agreements. So I don't think we'll get something like the European Court of Human Rights for the law of armed conflicts, but it's something that I regret. And I think the issue of military courts, except insofar as envisaged by the Geneva Conventions, I don't think the climate is one for creating military courts.
Thank you very much. I think, regretfully, I'm going to have to call a halt to proceedings at this point, but I think we've had a very stimulating session, and clearly we could have carried on. I hope if any of you do have questions that, remain unresolved, that there may be scope to address them in the next session. Lunch downstairs. What time do you want us back then?
13:45 as planned, please.
Okay, right, so we're going to have to do speed eating. But before we do that, could I please ask you to thank our two panelists for very stimulating presentations. Thank you.